Okay, so we'll make a start. So welcome along, everyone. This is the Hiko Papahonana Otago's Climate Change Research Network annual symposium keynote lecture. Thank you very much to Kevin Anderson for agreeing to give this keynote at 6 o'clock in the morning, I understand, UK time. So he's got up bright and early for us for this evening public lecture via Zoom. So Kevin is a professor of energy and climate change at the universities of Manchester in the UK, Uppsala in Sweden, and Bergen in Norway. He's formerly director of the Tyndall Centre, and he engages widely with governments and remains research active with publications in climate policy, nature and science. Kevin has decades industrial experience in the petrochemical industry, and he's a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. So thank you again, Kevin, for agreeing to give this. And I'd like to invite you to give you a talk called Getting Off a Moving Train, Timely Responses to the Climate Emergency, which ties in very nicely with our symposium talks earlier in the day.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's very nice to be with you. It's one of those occasions actually where I would rather be with you physically rather than virtually. It'd be very nice to be back in New Zealand. But anyway, this talk is going to focus on energy, which is my sort of the area of my research. So it's on energy and carbon dioxide. I'll just touch on agriculture towards the end. But I am fully aware that for New Zealand, agriculture, of course, is a huge issue. It's as important in terms of emissions as the energy sector. It's not an area I particularly work on. I have colleagues that work on agriculture. There's obviously crossover between the two, particularly when it comes to some of the negative emission technologies. But I'm going to focus today on the energy sector and on carbon dioxide. And I'm also going to focus probably mostly on some of the numbers in here later on, around 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming rather than 2 degrees centigrade of warming. But I'll come back to that a little as I go on through the presentation. I do have a Twitter account at Kevin Climate, which is a fairly active Twitter account, but it's only related to climate change. I don't post anything else about other things I'm doing. So it's just a work tool, really. So start. For some reason why it's not swapping this down. So I'm going to start by misusing JFK's quote from many years ago, John Kennedy, the old US president, and use the sort of statement that it's not what New Zealand can do to reduce its emissions, but it's what total emissions does Paris require of New Zealand. And of course, that's true for every country, that we continue to look, well, what can we do? Well, that's not what we signed up to. We signed up to say that we would deliver on our Paris commitments, which I'm going to come back to in a few minutes. But I want to start then by thinking about the banking crisis, because I want to look at these two crises that we've had in recent history. So the banking crisis, so we think in 2006, if you had said that we required rapid social change, that would, people said, well, that's impossible. We can never have that. And yet in 2007, we had the subprime mortgage scandal. That triggered a banking crisis from Lehman Brothers in the US. Then that was followed, at least in many parts of the world. I don't know the details in New Zealand, how badly it was affected. I know it was impacted, but certainly in Western Europe, and many other parts, the US, so forth, there was a decade of austerity policies, and certainly that was true for some of the poor countries as well. It also hit the poorest communities within those societies. There were huge cuts in public services. There was massive job insecurity. Sort of really very major social upheaval, and the governments, they put in this thing called quantitative easing, where they pumped in huge amounts of public money. And in the UK, it was about £500 billion, £500 billion. So about a quarter to a half of our GDP was pumped from the public sector into the private sector to try and stimulate the economy. So this would be seen to be impossible. That sort of level of money suddenly mobilized overnight. So we went really from the impossible to the achievable, and actually not the achievable, but the actual deliverable in 2 years. You roll on a few years later, and in 2019, if you had said, well, we want rapid social change, everyone said, oh, that's impossible, the public will never accept it. 2019-20, COVID triggered a global response. There were lockdowns, rapid mobilizations of science and tech, the treatments, the vaccines and so forth. Again, unfortunately, it was the poor people that were impacted. This is my experience from continental Europe anyway, and I'm not sure again about New Zealand. It responded very differently to COVID, certainly to the UK. But over here, it was very much the poorer key workers and people of colour who were disproportionately impacted by COVID, not least because of the social arrangements in our society. They were often the key workers in the more vulnerable positions. But again, we went from the impossible to the deliverable in 2 years. So when we hear about climate change, so we can't deliver something, we have actually achieved that with both the banking crisis, which I thought we responded to very badly, and COVID, which in some respects was much better in how we responded. In other ways, not particularly good, particularly here in the UK. So what about the emissions during COVID? What happened to those? I think it's quite important to think about that as a period when it's the only example in modern history we've seen such a significant drop in emissions. The estimates now are that globally it was somewhere between 4.5% to 5% per annum. In the UK, it was between 10 and 11%. Now, if that level of cuts continued, that would, year on year, that would give us a sort of, if we'd only just an outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade, but that gives a sort of flavour at a global level what was a really huge shift in many ways that we operate the globe for a year, almost 2 years. Well, certainly for one major year anyway. Then that was only just a reduction rate in energy use and hence emissions that was in line with 2 degrees centigrade. So are we learning lessons from this tragedy in thinking about how we respond to climate change? Well, the signs are not looking good. The poorest and the wealthiest countries are still seeking ongoing economic growth. So we're turning back to that old way of thinking with more energy, more resource consumption, the timely decoupling of growth from emissions at least at scale. There's an appealing myth, and there's no evidence to show that's really occurring. Not when you look at the full carbon footprint of a country, not just its territorial footprint, so if you take out of its imports and exports. And certainly I think it's fair to say that economic growth is to be welcomed by poorer nations. We definitely want to see that and significant economic growth in many of the poor parts of the world. But in the UK, in the EU, in the US, Japan, New Zealand, is it still appropriate that we're actually looking to grow our economies? We're already fantastically wealthy. We maybe have very poor distribution of that wealth, but we are incredibly wealthy countries. And yet we're still looking to grow more. So I now want to just have one slide here really on what I call a little bit of science. And in some ways, there's a slightly flippant comment here, because the climate does not respond, when we think about it from a science point of view, it does not respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, to eloquent arguments, legal niceties, or accountancy scams. All of these are trumped by the beauty of the physics, the brutal beauty of the physics. And what really matters is the total quantity of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide particularly, and other greenhouse gases that we dump in the atmosphere. It's these that relate to temperature. So it sees straight through all of the policies from usually the old grey-haired men in suits. Not always the case, of course, in New Zealand either. But it is important to remind ourselves that we have to actually reduce our emissions. We can't keep coming up with all these other protocols that don't actually cut our emissions. So if we now think about our Paris commitments, which we all signed up to in 2015, including, of course, New Zealand, and we think about what that committed us to, it committed us to reduce our emissions to hold global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally pursue just 1.5. And to do this in accordance with the best science, and very importantly, on the basis of equity. And every single country, rich country in the world, has pretty much ignored the equity part of this. And if you listen to the negotiations discussion in COP again this year, in the COP in Glasgow, again, lip service was the best that we paid equity. Unfortunately, that has been the case since the whole concept of common but differentiated responsibility, the equity part of the major international agreements on climate change, was established in 1992. The rich countries have looked to weaken it every single year. Now, as I say today, I'm going to focus on 1.5, which was quite a shock when it appeared in the Paris Agreement. Many people weren't expecting to see that included as well. And of course, in the COP this year, it was the principal focus was this 1.5 degree centigrade of warming. And a consequence of the 1.5 in the Paris Agreement was that the sort of world leaders asked the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to look at the impacts at 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. And I think probably on certainly a cold day in the Peak District in the UK and many other parts of the world, that 1.5 doesn't sound like a significant temperature rise, but you have to think, well, that's a global average temperature. That's a huge shift in the amount of energy that was actually locked into the atmosphere, with all implications that will have, with a lot of geographical variation in terms of weather, particularly exacerbating more extreme weather. And in summary, when the scientists who looked at these impact issues looked at 1.5, what was clear was you were going to get severe impacts, even just that level of warming, across all ecosystems, all human systems, physical infrastructure, and agriculture. More floods, more droughts, more extinctions, and more human migration. And actually, just very quickly on the sea level rise that goes with that, having just come back from COP and I spent quite a lot of time talking to Jason Box, who's a professor who looks at Greenland. Greenland's actual level of melt that they're seeing today is already way higher. The empirical data they're actually measuring is already way higher than they anticipated, even in the highest emission scenarios, what's called RCP 8.5. So, even with 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, which sounds not a lot of warming, Greenland is melting incredibly quickly. And the estimates from Jason and Twillo and other experts in Greenland saying that they would not be surprised at all if they see 1 to 1.5 meters across this century as an average, which of course will be worse in some parts of the world than others. But although these impacts at 1.5 degrees centigrade look really severe, the impacts at 2 are considerably worse. If you think about something emblematic like the barrier reef, you wipe out the barrier reef at 2 degrees centigrade and virtually all tropical corals. But at 1.5, you wipe out about 3/4 of them. So there's a notable difference between those two, just half a degree. But let's not pretend in any way that 1.5 is a safe threshold. It's not. It's incredibly dangerous temperature-wise, but I would argue it's probably the best that we can do. And I think this focus on 1.5 and a better understanding of the impacts, it was a sort of prelude to a whole set of climate emergencies. So in the UK, we had the ones that was in Scotland or in the UK, the EU, and of course New Zealand declared one in 2020, I think it was. So we've had these declarations of climate emergencies from all countries pretty much around the world. And then this year, May of this year, we had the G7 countries. They met and actually strengthened the 1.5 element of the commitments that governments were making. And so that was the sort of prelude to the COP focus on 1.5. But I think we also have to stop and remind ourselves that roughly 1.1 degrees centigrade of warming that we've seen so far is already having dire consequences around the world. If you look at some of the poor parts of the world, and this is typical, sadly, is the poor parts that seem to be the most vulnerable, both geographically, but also because they haven't got the wherewithal to deal with some of the impacts. So you see many poor people who have not been part of the problem have had very, very low emissions and now been suffering the implications of our emissions, and knowing that we knew that this was going to happen. It's not as if we didn't know this. We've known this, and we haven't, to be brutally honest, we have not cared. And we're already seeing the impacts on many emblematic ecosystems, and we think about that not just in terms of the ones that we aren't directly benefiting from necessarily, or not directly as some people are, but other things like the insects and how come they're so important for pollinating our crops. We're really seeing significant changes in some parts of the world in insect communities, which is really worrying when you think about that. They're required obviously for our food production. We're we've already locked in significant damage for our children in the future. So we're not as if we're just 1.5 or 2. Actually, what we've done now is already significantly affect their futures. So our current and our recent and our current emissions are today killing people around the world and causing destruction and devastation to many communities. So it's not as if climate change is not an issue about the future. For many parts of the world, climate change is an issue about the present. And I think it's really important for particularly those of us who are in the northern hemisphere, and often quite insulated from the direct physical impacts of climate change, the more extreme versions of it. We have to remind ourselves of this. This is already occurring today. So I now want to focus on reducing our emissions, which is my principal area of research, and ask really to start off with, how are we doing? So how successful are we in reducing our emissions thus far? Well, I think our generation, my generation, I'm 59, my generation, and even the generation after me, I suppose, now really needs a bit of humility here. The first IPCC report came out in 1990, 31 years ago. And as I often say to my students, point out that's before their parents met. So we've had a really rich stream of scientific information and evidence on issues of climate change for 31 years, over 3 decades. And yet in 2021, this year, emissions will be some 60%, probably near 62% higher than they were in 1990. So a significant rise, and they're still going up. There's nothing at the moment to suggest that they will stabilize this year or even indeed next year. And certainly listen to the discussions in the Glasgow COP this year, it doesn't look at all like we're going to see any stabilisation of emissions, possibly for quite a few years to come. So despite lots of optimistic rhetoric at every sort of major international negotiation we've had over the 30 years, so 26 of the COPs, the Conference of the Party negotiations, we have to recognise that what we've presided over, at least collectively, is 31 years of abject failure to reduce our emissions. And I think sometimes we have to stop and just take a moment to remind ourselves that's what we've been party to. 31 years of failure. And it's always easy to turn around and blame someone else, but we have to think of particularly those of us who are the high emitters and have some influence in sort of governments and so forth around the world, that we are the ones that are responsible for that. And of course, the way that every country deals with it is to claim that they're showing leadership. So isn't the UK showing leadership on climate change? Now, I did a bit of a search in New Zealand, didn't find quite such arrogant attitudes as we have in the UK, but I'm sure that New Zealand would also claim that it's doing some wonderful things on climate change. And certainly the UK makes the claim that emissions in 2020 were down 51% compared with 1990. And even in 2019, which was a higher emission year pre-COVID, they were down 44% compared with 1990. This is something we regularly hear from the UK government, from the UK government's own Committee on Climate Change, who are, well, they claim independent, but not in my view. They're a government agency who provide information to the government about climate change. But they don't include, those estimates don't include international aviation and shipping, both really important for the UK, but also similarly very important, of course, for New Zealand. They don't include our imports and exports. Again, New Zealand, very important in terms of considering those. And if you do include those to give a real sort of full handle of our carbon footprint, what you realise is that we've seen no real leadership in the UK since 1990. We've had a 15% reduction in emissions. We haven't had this 44 to 51% reduction. That's less than 0.5% every single year. Now, that's also true for Denmark, Sweden, France, and the rest of the EU. There are no progressive countries when it comes to climate change, particularly amongst the so-called the richer, wealthier countries of the world. There's no good examples out there. They're just examples of basically just pretty much the status quo. What of New Zealand? Well, you declared a climate emergency, say 2020, and as far as I can see, it's probably one of the worst of the industrialized countries. In the rise in carbon dioxide emissions is somewhere around about 50% since 1990, so a significant increase, and very little in more recent times. It's managed to stay very high as well, as quite a few of the wealthier industrialized countries in Europe, their emissions went up significantly, then dropped after the banking crisis, but not, of course, through climate change policies, more because of the austerity. So we have no good examples out there. And what's New Zealand's response to the climate emergency? Now, it sounds like here I'm picking on New Zealand, but I'm trying to just, these slides are written a little bit more around New Zealand, but this is equally true of the UK and other parts of the world, rich parts of the world as well. Unlike COVID and the banking crisis, when we have this emergency that everyone announces in their governments with great fanfare, there's no sweeping and rapid social change. There's no immediate and widespread penetration of low carbon technologies. Yes, we've got some more renewable power, plus oil, gas and coal. Yes, we've got some electric vehicles, plus petrol, diesel cars, and we're still selling, I think there's still, in the UK and much of Europe, we're still selling more sports utility vehicles, these huge four-wheel drive things, than we are electric vehicles. And certainly we've seen some improvements in efficiency, plus more consumption. And I think it's fair to say, I've tried to have a look at this for New Zealand actually, that your well, not wholly, but mostly government-owned airline company, Air New Zealand, that's now again post-COVID putting adverts up there to encourage more flying within New Zealand, but also, of course, more flying internationally and to New Zealand at a time when we've got a climate emergency. So I would argue that this whole sort of framing we have around climate change, net zero 2050, which I'll come back to a little bit later, I mean, that's basically broadly supporting incremental adjustments to business as usual. There's nothing like the response that we saw to either the banking crisis or to COVID. So it's just a little bit of greenwash. That's all we've seen so far. And that's what, in my view, that's all we saw at the COP this year in Glasgow. So what does the IPCC, what does the science tell us about Paris and our G7 commitments? So around 1.5 degrees centigrade, or 2 degrees to 1.5. What's absolutely clear, if you take the sort of main reports since AR5, SR 1.5 and AR6, the assessment report, the most recent one, that it's not these long-term targets. It's not net zero by 2050 or net zero by 2045 for Scotland and Sweden. These sorts of targets are pretty meaningless. It's the total amount of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere that matters, our carbon budget. And that's the way that we need to be thinking about our policies. That's what we need to inform our policy framing. But that's a very different agenda from this net zero 2050. And just to give sort of, for those of you who aren't completely familiar with the carbon budget concept, when they say this all comes out of the science, it's the area under the curve that you can see here that matters. So what we do by 2050, say it's pretty relevant in isolation. It's what we do in total, and that means what we do particularly in the short term. So if in the UK we expand our airports as we are doing, and if we build 27 billion pounds of new roads as we are doing, then the future generations will have to cut their emissions still further. And I would argue here that that's going to be impossible. Now, this, I'm sure, I don't know the details in New Zealand, but I'm sure it's looking to expand its aviation sector as well. And if you look at some of the poor parts of the world, quite understandably, they're looking to grow their emissions. And so what you see here is that the carbon budget framework requires us to focus on the very near term. We can't just rely on doing these things in the future. And if we look now at the latest report from the IPCC, AR6, so the one that just came out over this summer, actually, then what we get from there is we get these tables that give us a handle on the total amount of carbon dioxide, these carbon budgets that we can emit if we want to stay within certain temperatures. So you can see the temperatures on the left-hand side here. And so if we want to stay at 1.5 and want a good chance of staying at 1.5, we know we can emit about 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide from now out to across this century, effectively forever, for the next 200 years or so. And we can emit a bit more if we want a low chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade. But note these are from 2020, so you've still got to adjust these straight away to well, pretty much 2022. So there's 2 more years of emissions have to come off this. And adjusting with those 2 years to January 2022 and thinking about energy only, then for a likely chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade, the budget that we would have is somewhere between 270 to 520 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Now that may mean something to some of you, but probably not a lot to many of you. But we're currently emitting about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide, 2019, and again this year looks like it'd be pretty much the same as that year. So that's 8 to 14 years of current emissions, 8 to 14 years before we blow the budget, the good budget and the outside budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's a completely different story to all of this net zero 2050 nonsense we heard at COP, or sometimes even net zero 2060 and net zero 2070. What we have is this, and I'll come back to this later, this sort of pie, this global carbon pie. We know how large it is with some uncertainties, but it gives us a good handle of the size of this pie, depending on how robust we want to be in trying to aim for 1.5 degrees centigrade. What we have to try and do, of course, is then split that pie up. But before we split it up, we have to remind ourselves, we also signed up with the Paris Agreement, and every single negotiation since the UNFCCC was set up in 1992, that we will reduce our emissions on the basis of equity. And that's basically the wealthy parts of the world will have longer to make that, so we'll have to reduce their emissions in a shorter period of time than the poor parts of the world. So the developing country parties, as they're called, the Paris Agreement, has longer to make the transition away from fossil fuels. And that's a really important criteria embedded in every agreement, including the Paris Agreement. So you then ask, what is a fair slice for the developing country parties and the developed country parties? Bear in mind that 80% of the world population, of course, lives in the poor parts of the world and developing countries. And for a good chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade, these are 2 plots we did based on the paper we produced last year, looking at developed and developing countries. So this is a good chance of 1.5. What you see for the developed countries, for the wealthy parts of the world, which of course includes New Zealand, is that we need to be zero by about 2030. And that's why we didn't discuss this separation really in any detail in the Glasgow COP, because we don't like the repercussions. Our policymakers don't like what the maths tell us. But if we're happy with an outside chance of 1.5, it doesn't give us much longer. It takes us out to about 2035. So we've still really got very little time to reduce our emissions to zero. And I mean, just to note there that the poor parts of the world also, if you look at it, particularly for the good chance of 1.5, they're also hitting zero quite early in the 2040s. So it's not as if the poor countries get away with a lot here. And bear in mind, the orange line there is where 80% of the people live, and the blue bar is where 20% of the population live. So if we then look at the developed country country parties, and then we can ask ourselves, how much should New Zealand get if it's going to play its fair part in delivering on the 1.5 or even the 2 degree centigrade framing. Now, very provisionally, and this is very provisional because I've not done the detailed work for New Zealand, but we have done this for the UK and Sweden. We've done it now for a number of other countries as well. Depending exactly what assumptions you make, if you want a fair assessment, then New Zealand's fair 1.5 degree territorial budget is somewhere between 100 and 150 million tonnes of carbon dioxide from 2022. That's 2 to 5 years of New Zealand's current emissions, which are somewhere about 34 million tonnes. But that excludes aviation and shipping, which I've not looked at the details for New Zealand, but I'm guessing is probably going to be somewhere in the region of 10% on top of that. So 2 to 5 years of current emissions, and New Zealand will blow its fair contribution for 2 degrees, for 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if you go to well below 2, it doesn't expand it hugely, 4 to 7, possibly out to 8 years. That's, it's a very, very short time frame. So that's, of course, if you carry on at current levels, the trick would be to bring them down, and that gives us a bit longer to make that transition. But if we carry on like we're doing now, in no time at all, we're going to blow through those budgets. We should, when you look at these numbers, we should be treating it like the emergency it is. If we sign it up to it being an emergency, if we sign up to doing 1.5 degrees centigrade, well, look, we should act accordingly. And just to give a feel, well, as I said, that means 0 emissions by 2030 to 2035. That's real zero, not net zero. So you can have no emissions from energy by that sort of time frame. Planes, trains, ships, industry. That sounds impossible. Well, that's what comes about from 31 years of choosing to do nothing. We've squandered the carbon budget. And what did we expect? The physics wasn't going to play ball. The physics is the physics. And we knew what the physics was in 1990, and we chose to squander it. So that's immediate and profound system change. This is a huge shift in anything we would recognize in the way we've been responding thus far. So why is this so different to the net zero 2050 framing that we so often hear about, or for China 2060, or for India 2070? Now, this is something I talk about quite a lot normally, but I'm going to just touch on it here. Net zero, which I always joke and say net zero is Latin for kick the can down the road. First, it's not based on carbon budgets, so it's not really based on the science. It's not downscaled to New Zealand from the science. And though it used to be in the UK, we now have moved away from that. So we have short-term carbon budgets that don't add up to a fair carbon budget to the UK. So we no longer have we're not no longer guided by the science. We're guided by what the Committee on Climate Change, our policymakers, judge as highest possible ambition. So we've gone for the approach of, what can the UK be bothered to do, not what does the UK need to do to meet its Paris commitments. And that's true for most countries in the world. This focus, of course, net zero by 2050, is focusing on far off points. And the one thing you can guarantee is that the people in power today won't be in power in 2050. The academics advising them won't be in power, won't be working in 2050. They'll either be dead or retired. And I think that's really important to recognize this. We're already passing this burden on to future generations. I'm not going to focus here on this, but it relies on a huge substitution between different types of greenhouse gases. So it's not net zero CO2, it's net zero GHGs typically. And you look at what a lot of governments are looking at, and you look at accompanying spreadsheets, it's often shifting between different greenhouse gases, between CO2 and methane, for instance, or nitrous oxide. These have very different residence times, lifetimes in the atmosphere, very different chemistries, and hugely different levels of uncertainty associated with them. But there's also substitution between sectors. So the idea that you can reduce emissions from how we look after animals in the mid-30s, and that can compensate for ongoing carbon dioxide emissions from our cars or our planes today. It completely misunderstands issues of certainty and the residence times in the atmosphere. They're also, these assumptions are also reliant on at huge planetary scale, and this is true for all of the IPCC scenarios in Working Group 3 as well, on massive uptake of negative emission technologies. These technologies do not exist at scale today. There are a few pilot plants, and the rest of them in the imagination of some academics. But we're completely reliant in the models on these planetary scale negative emission technologies. Virtually all the models assume that those or some other nature-based solution would be roughly the same as the current oil and gas industry is globally. So an industry that does not exist today, we assume will that be that big in virtually, I think it's fair to say, every scenario, either the technologies or some nature-based solution. What we are doing is passing a huge part of the mitigation burden because we cannot be bothered to put stringent policies in place today onto the next generation. There's this huge generational shift in responsibility. And the work that I've undertaken with colleagues and that's published last year shows that the UK framing, which it claims is world leading, is much more, and indeed the same for Sweden, is much more in line with 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of warming than 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. I just wanted to add that my position on carbon dioxide removal, on negative emissions and so forth, is that we should fund a huge R&D program into it. It's really important that we do that. And deploy them as well if they meet stringent sustainability criteria. And that includes social criteria, because there's a lot of deliberate sort of green land grabs going on by wealthy countries, which is having a big impact on particularly indigenous people elsewhere in the world, but lots of other communities that live in and around forests. But we need to reduce our emissions, particularly from energy here, assuming that carbon dioxide removal does not work at scale. Firstly, most people who look at the negative emission technologies, even the ones put them in the models, privately say they don't think they will work at the scale that's in the models. So we're already overplaying what we think will happen. But the main reason we shouldn't be doing that is because we will require some carbon dioxide removal to compensate for the ongoing warming from agricultural emissions, from residual emissions from agriculture, particularly methane and N2O, so from fertilizer use and even just ploughing a field. Even the whole world went vegan and didn't eat rice, then you're probably still talking about 6 to 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent of warming year on year, just from trying to feed 8 to 10 billion people. And so you cannot use your negative emissions to compensate for energy. So energy emissions need to be zero. And look at spreadsheets amongst governments. They've got a net zero framing, those that have developed spreadsheets behind them, and you'll find that they're looking to compensate for ongoing high energy use out into the future with negative emissions. So there's a lot of double counting going on there. So and now I want to think about, well, what would action look like if we were serious about climate change? And I've only used one equation in this presentation, that's this equation. And it's one that most of us high emitters don't really like. It's that Paris, our commitments in Paris, plus the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, equals equity if you play this out. CO2 is highly skewed towards the few. This is something that you're hopefully all reasonably familiar with now. There's a lot more discussion around this, that half of the world's carbon dioxide comes from 10% of the population, 70% from 20% of the population. And this, I think, really damning figure that's just come out this year from some work that's been done, well, that was last year by Sivan Carter and also Tim Gore. The top 1% of global emitters emit twice as much as the bottom half of the world's population. I mean, that is absolutely damning. That our inequalities are that deeply embedded. And the question you often get, particularly from us wealthy high emitters, is, does this really matter? There's only a few of us, does it matter? Well, a quick thought experiment. Imagine we thought climate change was really a climate emergency and it was an existential threat. And that we therefore put in different countries who put regulations to force the top 10% to cut their CO2 in line with the European average. So not a really low level, but just that level. And the other 90% made no reductions. That alone would give us a 1/3 cut in global carbon dioxide. That's a huge reduction just from that. And it's not going to be enough, but it just demonstrates how the emissions are massively skewed to a relatively small proportion of the population. And we know who they are, and it includes most of us in the climate, as climate scientists and climate academics. So I want to now sort of pull this together and to give some sort of sense of where we can go from here. The headline choice for developed nations is that, if our preference is to ignore international equity, to pass a huge burden on to our children, to be part of a 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade warming future, maybe even more than that, and to renege on our Paris commitments, our G7 commitments and so forth. But that allows us to dovetail our policies with current politics. It allows us to maintain the current economic market model. It allows incremental sort of green adjustments to business as usual. So it's very attractive from that point of view. Then fine, choose 5% mitigation and net zero by 2050. If our preference alternatively is to take international equity seriously, then we need a huge mitigation effort by this generation to cut CO2 in line with well below 1.5 degrees centigrade or even 2 degrees centigrade, and to abide by our Paris and G7 commitments. But that will mean a massive ramping up in government intervention, profound reshaping of our economics. Both of the first two, of course, we've had to do, both with austerity, the banking crisis, and indeed with COVID, and immediate and deep cuts across all sectors. There are no exempt sectors, including aviation, on this. Now, this is about 10 to 20% per annum reductions in emissions, 10 to 20% every single year, starting now. The wealthy countries nearer the 20%, the poorer countries nearer of the wealthy group rather, nearer the 10%. So if you're Portugal or Poland, you might be near 10% or 10 to 15%. If you're a wealthy country like the UK or the US, then you're probably nearer 20 to 25%. And that's real zero by 2030 to 2035 for our energy emissions, not net zero, real zero. If we think about the next COP, because this one, at least in my judgment, was, okay, lots of nice words, lots of eloquence, lots of journalists spinning a good tale, lots of governments spinning a good tale, but it was an utter disaster relative to our commitments, relative to the carbon budgets that we have for 1.5 degrees centigrade. We need to have zero fossil fuel production and use in wealthy countries by 2035 at the outside. And then poor countries by 2050 at the very outside. So this should be absolutely in there, zero fossil fuel, not zero fossil fuel use, not abated coal and inefficient subsidies to be removed. I mean, there's nothing good in the current COP agreement. No substitution for carbon dioxide removal, which is embedded all over the current COP, the Glasgow Protocol. A major program of R&D into negative emissions, well, we're already starting to see that to some extent, but that I think probably needs ramping up. Also, to recognise that climate is just one of a whole suite of ecological challenges which are sort of beg some deeper questions about how our society in modern times is operating. Given we've been here for 200 to 300,000 years, we're only really seeing these problems arrive in the last 100 years. Well, maybe 200 years, but something in recent years anyway, in terms of CO2, only in the last 50 years, significantly. We need huge financial transfers to poor parts of the world to help them leapfrog fossil fuels and, of course, to deal with the impacts of climate change that we've imposed upon them. We need strict control on the other greenhouse emissions, the non-CO2 emissions, the greenhouse gases, which are, for New Zealand, is probably for New Zealand more than many parts of the world, is massively important. And we need to embed equity and fairness as a key element of all mitigation. That's between nations, but also within our nations. If we are to deliver on our Paris commitments, our G7 commitments, then I think we need a whole set of new narratives about what constitutes growth, progress, and development. We need to reframe values in our society, what's important in our society, and how we reward success. Particularly after COVID, we've recognised that the real important people in our society, actually the key workers, are often paid the least. So we need to rethink about the whole issue of value, of valuing and success. We need a different relationship with time, learning lessons from the past and genuinely thinking about the future and using that to guide what we do today. We've not done that so far. We always discount the future. We need to embed intra and intergenerational equity, which we're ignoring both of those again at the moment. And I think we need a much deeper appreciation of the more than human world, of which, of course, we are part. We cannot escape it. Our technologies, as an engineer, I really like technologies, but it cannot escape us from the fact that we are deeply embedded in the sort of natural fabric of our planet. So where are the catalysts for change? For this is a huge shift. Well, they're not the usual suspects. It's not the policymakers. It's not the academics. They don't look to those of us who have failed for 30 years on climate change. It's going to come from different voices. Now, who would have thought a 15-year-old schoolgirl 3 or 4 years ago would change the tone of the debate on climate change? Supported by school strikes and many youth movements from many parts of the world now. They're not just Northern Hemisphere, they're elsewhere in other parts of the world as well. And there are all sorts of civil society groups. And even though we have things like flying shame, or as I prefer to see it, flying consciousness, these are sort of new concepts and ways of thinking that are changing the debate on climate change. So what can we do? Well, I think we have to identify our own, as individuals here, we have to identify our own carbon footprint and try really hard to reduce them. But the important thing is that other than the incredibly wealthy people in the world, that won't make much difference in isolation. But once you actually made those changes, once you're trying to make those changes, even if we're not successful, talking about them with our friends, our family, our work colleagues, we're starting to change the debate. We're starting to try things. We're experimenting. We're saying this wasn't easier. That thing was easier. This is what happened here. So that dialogue is really important. We know from repeated psychological research that the credibility of our arguments is improved if in fact we try to do it ourselves. So just talking about it and not trying it actually reduces the impact that it has on other people. Engage in our universities, our places of work, our local councils, contact our MPs, talk with them, make suggestions about what we should be doing, disagree when they do things that we don't think are appropriate, but do that also at the national level. Email our MPs, use social media, use the old-fashioned type of media, get involved with the MPs, development ministers, the members of our parliament, and so forth. Express our concerns Ask them why their actions are falling far short of their commitments, or why do they make these commitments? They have no intention of delivering on them. But also, when they do something that's good, let them know. We're really good at, particularly British people, we're really good at moaning, and very seldom do we actually say, that's good, you're doing really well there. If we think about this at a national level, I think this is true for New Zealand as much as it is for the UK. We need an immediate moratorium on all new fossil fuel development, a moratorium on airport expansion. We need to phase out all fossil fuel production by 2035 at the latest, but recognizing that in doing that, we've got to help the people in those industries transfer across to do other worthwhile tasks in our society. And there's no shortage of those. We're going to need a lot of work doing if we're going to move our infrastructure to be zero carbon. We need to make sure that any new buildings are passive house that they require. That means they require no heating, no cooling. They can use on-site renewables as well. A major retrofit for our existing buildings, again, very important for the UK because our building stock, our houses are in a really very bad condition, thermodynamically anyway. So that's a big issue, to retrofit our existing buildings. Move away from cars, including moving away from electric vehicles in our cities and dense urban environments. Important in the rural areas perhaps, but not important in our cities. Facilitate a major shift to active public and virtual transport. A frequent flyer levy to stop the people who are actually the ones that drive aviation. I'm sure that's true for New Zealand as it is for here. 70% of all our flights are taken by 15% of the population, and they're always, of course, the high emitters in every other facet of their lives as well. So you're not going to stop occasional trips, but we are stopping the people who dominate the flying. No more fossil fuel power stations, and a massive program of electrification, because in most parts of the world, most industrialized countries, only about 20% of the energy we consume is actually electricity. Most of it is just direct use of fossil fuels. So that's it on energy, but I'm just going to finish off with one note that in New Zealand particularly, this has to be matched with massive cuts in our methane and nitrous oxides from agriculture. That's not going to be easy for New Zealand. It's going to require massive social change that I know there's a lot of opposition to, but there is no easy way out of this. We should have done it before. We chose to fail. So we are where we are because of our own fault, not for someone else. And so New Zealand's agricultural sector, like all of its energy sectors, will need to have massive reductions in its emissions, from changes in diets, changes in its animal husbandry practices, and you don't have to become vegetarian, but certainly big shifts, particularly from eating red meats. So on that note, oh no, sorry, final slide. In 2021, climate change has become system change. As Einstein noted, or at least it's attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And what have we just sat through in Glasgow? The same thing by the same people and the same result. Thus far, we've chosen to pass on to our own children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. And net zero 2050 is the latest incarnation of that insanity. So on that note, I hope that spelling is correct. Thanks very much for listening. I assume someone's still there.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Kevin. So it's a webinar, so people can kind of clap with symbols, but not really clap live. We've had a couple of people in the question just asking about the recording. So Kevin has kindly agreed that this can be recorded, and Julia will be sending out a link to it afterwards. If people have got questions about what Kevin said in his talk, please type them into the Q&A and I will read them out. And so we've got the first one from Sean, who's asking Kevin to please discuss the work of Polly Higgins on ecocide law, the barriers to it, and how Aotearoa can support this initiative. You familiar with Polly Higgins's work?
I am, and obviously it's tragic that she died so early. I'm familiar with it, but I'm no expert on it, so I won't make many comments other than, I mean, thankfully that work is being carried on, and I think it has real potential to help drive a change. And I think more widely, at last we are seeing the legal profession step up to the mark and start to attempt to use legal tools to drive significant change. And even when we're not successful, I get involved with lots of legal cases on all sorts of things to do with climate change, and most of them aren't successful. Usually it's developments, high carbon developments that fit under net zero framing. A few have been stopped, but not many of them. But even when they're not successful, I think what it already is doing is changing how developers think about investments that they're making. So ecocide is a really important part of the whole sort of legal set of options that are available. It's one I won't go into any detail because it's not what I know. I mean, probably the speaker, the questioner may know more about it than I do. All I'm saying is I think it's really important, and thanks to Polly Higgins for all the work that she did on that, and to the other people that are working on it today.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll just wait for some other questions to come in. So I'll just ask you one, Kevin. So thank you very much for putting that in the New Zealand context. That was great, and more than we anticipated and expected. So I'm not sure if you know, in the New Zealand context, we don't just have airport expansion proposals. We actually have proposals for entirely new international airports, at least one of them. So in terms of a geographically isolated country like New Zealand, in terms of people movements and also goods, it's obviously a challenge. And you alluded to the agricultural emissions being such a big proportion. It's about 48%, I think, of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. About 95% of that is actually exported as well. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts on reconstructing the New Zealand economy that would be consistent with climate change.
I don't know how badly the New Zealand economy was hit by the banking crisis, but I think it's interesting that for many of the wealthy parts of the world, their economies have been in part reconstructed since 2007, 2008, really. We lived through banking crisis, then we lived through austerity, and then we live through COVID. So we haven't had a normal economy or normal governments for quite a long period of time. And yet governments are desperately clamoring back to going back to what we did before, which is completely at odds with what the science is telling us on climate change. On aviation alone, yeah, it will mean, I appreciate it's much harder for New Zealand than it will be for many other parts of the world, or other richer parts of the world. But there are wonderful benefits and merits from living in New Zealand. So you have to recognize, our geographies bring certain things with them. You get lots of benefits. You've got low population density. You've got a really beautiful countryside. You're a beautiful country in total. You've got lots of potential resources. Well, you have got lots of resources, ones you're using and other ones that are available. And so maybe, it doesn't mean that you will be more isolated, at least physically, by the parts of the world. But you have to recognize other virtues of being in New Zealand. It will mean, there's no easy way out of this. For aviation, there are no technologies in the near term, in the time frame that lies at 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, that are going to help aviation in this. And if you talk to the engineers, not necessarily to the finance directors of aviation companies, you talk to the actual engineers working on these things, they'll tell you that. I attend, and I have colleagues who work in detail on aviation. They attend lots of these events, and the engineers will always tell you it'll be 2040 to 2050 before we get anything significant. You may get some electric planes that allow a few people, maybe 3, 4, 5, up to 10 people doing some local trips. That might work soon, but international flights, that won't happen. And all this nonsense about sustainable aviation fuel, just look at the numbers behind it. To produce that much fuel will require huge amounts of energy to go into making it, or huge amounts of biomaterial going in to do it. And every time we're doing that, we're not using that energy for other more important things in our society. So New Zealand should not be building new airports. We need to really rapidly move away from aviation in the very near term. And that's why I put the frequent flyer comment on there, is that most of aviation will be dominated by relatively few people. So we need to make sure that the people who are the high emitters, that they are forced to stop being high emitters. And that would allow other people to still have the occasional flight that doesn't visit their family and so forth elsewhere. It would also be hard for the agricultural sector in New Zealand. As I say, exports a huge amount of its, particularly of meat. And so that's going to be a big issue in terms of its economy. And it is going to have to restructure that to see how can it do that differently. A lot of those emissions from New Zealand are related to meat production. So are there other crops that can use? Other forms of agriculture it can use? Can it move away from red meat? So I'm not an expert in agriculture, but obviously we know that ruminants are much worse than non-ruminant animals. So pigs and chickens and so forth are much lower emissions than cattle and sheep. And I can hear lots of people saying, oh, well, they're all grass-fed in New Zealand and it's much better and so forth, but they still have very high emissions. So we are facing a difficult situation. We should have started doing this earlier. We didn't. We are in an emergency situation across every sector if we're serious about climate change. So do not expect business as usual. I don't mean that sound callous. It requires every sector to change, and that includes those of us in academia. We've got to change all our field work, how we travel, how we engage with international students. All those things need to be fundamentally rethought to become low carbon.
Great, thank you. The questions are starting to pile in now. There's two that I'll kind of merge in together. I think Ivan Johnston and Janet Stevenson have both asked about financial aspects. So Ivan's asked, will financial modelling alone help to plan towards a transition from fossil fuels to renewables? And Janet Stevenson has asked, what is your view on the effectiveness of carbon pricing and what price is needed to be truly influential?
Yeah. I mean, there are other colleagues who are some economist colleagues I have who think that finance and pricing is a way that will really help. I think it's so far it's been part of the problem that we've thought we can just do it by sort of incremental adjustments to prices. Certainly in some sectors, in some things, it can be important. So within a sector, it may well be that you can use price as a stimulus to shift from one. So I know that, for instance, in the power sector, sometimes just changing the prices there can make quite a difference to what power station types that investors will invest in. Overall, this idea of a huge carbon tax is deeply regressive. Unless you've got something like a fee and dividend approach, whereby you put a huge carbon price on, because you've got to remember you've got to drive the emissions out of the high emitters. The high emitters are the ones that are driving most of our emissions and our emissions growth. The problem with that group is they're very, very wealthy. They're pretty much inelastic to the price of the price of fossil fuels. As you put the price up, we can just change we can just afford to pay the price. We're not going to have to change our behaviours. But for poor people in our communities, they're of course going to really struggle. So, and that's true at a global level as well. So I think the idea that we can just put a price on it and then bring about a shift really misunderstands the deep inequality that we have. But I think within particular sectors, you can use price as a mechanism. But my preference overall is to generally use regulations to respond to a lot of these things, regulations and standards. But the fee and dividend approach, which has been sort of popularised by James Hansen and others, where you put a very high carbon price on, but then you hand out that revenue equally to all of your population. So if you did in New Zealand, you'd put a really high price on carbon, and then you would hand out that revenue to every New Zealand person equal per capita. And the benefit of that is that the poor people, of course, who are not using anywhere near as much, even the average consumer in New Zealand, who are not using anywhere near as much energy as the wealthy ones, they would get a lot more return from that relative to the wealthy. You also have to watch out for what's called the rebound effect in these things. If people have become wealthier and the price of the energy hasn't gone up sufficiently, then they can end up consuming more. But there are also equity issues there, because sometimes I think it's important, even in the poor and in the rich societies, to recognise that poor people in these rich societies need to be consuming more energy. Now, I'm saying that from a UK perspective, where we have about 10 to 20% of all of our homes in fuel poverty, with children in those houses suffering from bronchial conditions thanks to the low quality of the houses and lack of heating. So a lot of fungal issues in the air. And so if they have more money, hopefully they can put more heating into those houses, which means they'll use more energy, but they'll have much healthier lifestyles. But overall, because the wealthy of us have had to cut back our emissions, the emissions reduction should be significant. Remember, though, if we are to deliver on our 1.5 commitments, if you're trying to deliver 15, 20% per annum reductions in emissions, the carbon price to do that would have to be astronomical. You're not talking about $10, $20, $30 a tonne. You're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a tonne. And that's why I prefer a regulatory framework that has greater fairness to it. But we have to continue to remind ourselves of how fast we have to move away from fossil fuels. This is a rationing issue. That's what we're at. We've got to live in our carbon budget. How do you most fairly hand out a ration? By price or by need?
Great, thank you for that. We've got a question from Stuart Matheson, who's asking, is there a role for hydrogen? We know there are difficulties, but it's 20 times more explosive than petrol. Can we harness that to replace fossil fuels? And a bit of New Zealand context, our government is very excited about hydrogen at the moment. Every
government's excited about hydrogen. And they were again in the mid-1990s. Those who've been working on this for a long time. It was really popular then as well. I mean, as an engineer, I love technology. I'm not opposed to hydrogen at all. But what we're getting, you've got to think, how fast can we start producing this? So yes, we need to. I think it's probably, and it would vary from country to country. It's one of the technical options that is there. And certainly, I like the idea of hydrogen. Well, first I will add to this. I think we have to be very careful about being obsessed by particular technologies. As engineers, we tend to have our pet technologies, and we're sort of a bit obsessed by that particular one at the cost of everything else. I think we have to try and be a bit more technology agnostic as best we can. So my take on hydrogen is, yes, it looks like it's obviously low. It can be low carbon. I don't like this blue hydrogen made from gas. If you look at the full life cycle emissions for that, there's a good paper by Gibbon in 2017 that shows the life cycle emissions for these carbon capture and storage approaches, where you use, in this case, natural gas, then you split the CO2 and the hydrogen, and then you lock away the carbon. The life cycle emissions from that process are still very high, particularly getting the gas out of the ground, which is innately a very sort of polluting process with lots of emission releases. But if you get hydrogen from electrolysis using renewables, then that's green hydrogen, then that's very low carbon. It's not an easy material to look after. It tends, because it's very small molecules, tends to leak through everything. It makes metals much more brittle and so forth. And storing gas is not as easy as storing a liquid. If you mixed it with carbon, which you could get from carbon capture and storage, from direct air capture. So if you use renewable energy to capture the CO2 and you mix that with the hydrogen, then you could get liquid fuels. You can get hydrocarbons. You can make kerosene. So I think there are options for doing that. But it does require us, of course, to have lots of surplus renewable energy to do that, which we don't have at the moment. We haven't yet built that capacity. So it's certainly one of the things we should be looking towards, and trying to ramp it up as quickly as possible. But just look at how fast it will take how long it will take to do that. And also, I would say, do not be taken in by the myth of blue hydrogen. So we need to move to the natural gas version of it. We need to move very rapidly to green hydrogen, to proper production of hydrogen through electrolysis or through some other catalytic process using renewables.
Great, thank you. We've got an anonymous attendee's question. What do you think about fundamental research? We are also wasting a lot of energy on different projects. Do you think we should focus the full working force on climate-related research?
Oh. It's tempting as someone who works on climate change to say, oh yes, without a doubt. But no, we don't just face the climate emergency. I think we're facing problems with so many facets of our lives, and we never really know where those other merits will come from. So I get asked this about fusion quite a lot, because fusion is not going to deliver in anything like the time frame we have to respond to climate change. So should we stop doing the work on fusion? I think we learn a lot when we look at other things as well. The world is much more emergent than reductionist in reality. And so we don't know what will come out of these other things we look at. Certainly, I think we need to probably significantly increase our funding on, it's almost on the delivery end of the research. We need to increase the funding on that, because most of the time we know we've got the technologies available. We don't know how to deploy them so rapidly. So that's a really important issue. And we don't know some of the issues of scale. And in that, I'm not just about the technology research, but also the social science side. So we're really still, and that's much more culturally specific than the technologies. We need to understand how to respond to these challenges within our societies and within different socioeconomic groups, within the different cultural groups in our society. We don't want to leave anyone behind. But how do you do that? How do we bring everyone on board with this, or at least how do you help everyone live a good quality of life when responding to these as rapidly as we need to climate change? So I think I'd be reluctant to see all the funding shifted across to climate change. I think it's important we still look through, that money is available in other areas. Maybe sometimes it could have a bit of a focus of some of the work in the sort of social science and the humanities, if it could help us understand how to communicate these issues about different narratives. So we have a whole set of narratives, not just one way of looking at these issues. How we can bring more people on board, not necessarily through the language of climate change, but just the language of how we live our lives and living a good life and an ecologically appropriate life. So not the focus on necessarily the CO2 molecules and the numbers, the stuff that I love, but that isn't a good way of engaging with most people. So across the board, we need lots more engagement in the research, the technologies, particularly deployment, and that's linked to the social sciences and the humanities as well.
Great, and we'll close with this one last question, I think. So Danielle has said, I love your expression, there is no non-radical future, and I use this regularly when talking about climate change. I would love to hear you expand on this idea.
Well, it's simply this view that because we've chosen to leave it so late, and I'm deliberately using two words there, the we, means that those of us who have been responsible for, in government, in our companies, we know who this group is. It's the high emitters. It's the climate academics, the barristers, the entrepreneurs, the policymakers. It's all those wealthy groups in our society that drive much of the agenda of society. That group, we have chosen to fail on climate change for 30 years. And so now what do we face? We now face either radical shifts in how our economies work, how our societies operate, and in the physical infrastructure where we live, everything from our houses to our energy system, every part of our physical infrastructure is going to have to radically shift. And I often use the language as a bit like the reconstruction of Europe after it was blown apart in the Second World War. And there was a huge effort then to reconstruct Europe. It's that sort of scale of change we're talking about. So that's a radical shift to reduce our emissions. But if we don't do that, and people say, well, that's not possible, we can't do that. Well, we have done that sort of thing, something approaching it anyway before. Or we wait for the climate to hit us. And that is already hitting some parts of the world now, already very severely. And so that will require radical shifts in how we do something. But one of them we have control over. We can control the rapid move away from fossil fuels. It'll be difficult, it'll be challenging, but we have the tools to do that technically. We know what policy mechanisms we need to put in place. We have the wherewithal to make that shift. It can be done in a controlled fashion. It will be incredibly disruptive and difficult, but it will be controlled. Being hit by climate change will not be controlled. It will be chaos. And that future will be radically different, but much more disastrous. And we will just be, in many parts of the world, we'll just end up just dealing with each event as it arrives. And that will end up with lots of sort of divisiveness within our society, more military tension, more migration, all of those sorts of other sets of impacts, which we have almost no control over. So it's controlled radical change or uncontrolled radical chaos. And they're really the choices that we have. And I think most of us would argue, if we looked at our children over breakfast, we think we should do the controlled mitigation today.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. So thank you very much for that very thought-provoking and nicely tailored talk. That's a really great way for finishing off our He Kaupapa Haunga Otago's Climate Change Research Network Symposium today. It also gives a lot of food for thought, I think, for our colleagues at the Otago Energy Research Centre, whose symposium is on Thursday and Friday, and I know they'll be thinking about the post-COP 26 issues, things like fossil fuels to renewables transition. So I'm sure many of the delegates today will be going to that event as well, and thinking and pondering what you've left us with. So thank you very much again. Everyone can't quite clap because it's a webinar, but I'll clap on their behalf. Thank you very much again for your time. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more from you in the future, perhaps, and perhaps reading your New Zealand specific analysis that you've given us a taste of today. Okay, right. Well, it's nice to be with you virtually, and hopefully one day I can get back to New Zealand. I have been there by ship many moons ago. Yes, 6 weeks ago. Yeah. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you. Okay, take care. Bye for now. Bye.